Now, you're probably familiar with the term wellness. There's even a not so well defined thing called the wellness industry. It's very wide ranging, everything from people who make and market health foods and nutritional supplements to yoga and fitness and meditation experts, to people who package and sell essential oils, to doctors who take a more holistic approach to health and healing. We happen to have a nice set of essential oils in a pretty wooden box. And one night I was having a bad headache, and I had read that peppermint essential oil was really good for that. So, right before going to bed, I rubbed some peppermint oil on my wrists, which felt really wonderful and seemed to help. And it had the added benefit that I smelled just like a Christmas candy cane. So, I applied some more. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up in agony because while I was sleeping, I somehow rubbed my face and the peppermint oil went right into my eye, which felt kind of like my head was being skewered with a hot poker. So that was the last time I used essential oils, at least before going to bed. The thing is, we all like wellness and we pursue it because the alternative is unwellness. Who wants that? And there are lots of people eager to provide us and sell us stuff to enhance our wellness. It's not a bad thing. We want and we need to feel good and healthy and strong and balanced, physically and emotionally and spiritually. So we're willing to take a chance on things. We also seek wellness because at a deeper level, we all naturally want to have some control over our lives because so much that happens in our lives and in the world feels beyond our control and does not appear to make any rational sense. So, if we can take some control over ourselves, if we have the power to choose and to make a positive impact on how we're doing, then most of us are going to give that a try. Just avoid peppermint essential oil at night. I think we've all heard the phrase before, your faith has made you well. Jesus said that pretty often when someone's sight had been restored or they're able to walk again or they're cured of some horrible condition like leprosy. And the common assumption we have is the faith that person had in the ability of Jesus to heal them, their faith that even the possibility of being made whole again, that person's faith was the important thing. And Jesus, for his part, was certainly important because he represented what was possible through God's love. So it's something we should notice. Jesus wasn't especially eager to take on the mantle of being a faith healer. He regularly says, in effect, I didn't make this happen. It was your faith that made this happen. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But there's something we can also assume about that phrase, your faith has made you well, that's not so positive, that whenever things don't go the way we need them to, that our lack of faith must be the culprit. You've probably heard that before. I have. Maybe you've even felt it before yourself. You earnestly desire an outcome, and you might hope and pray night and day for that outcome, but that outcome just doesn't happen. So, what does that mean? Well, for a lot of folks, it means that they feel like they have failed somehow or that they're not living right according to God. Their concept of God is that of some judgmental being who's keeping track of all of our bad deeds and good deeds, and that to overcome any deficit we have on God's eternal balance sheet, there's a certain amount of praying and begging and pleading that we have to do to make up for all that. Otherwise, we're just not going to get the outcome that we need. Now, I think I've told this story before, but it's worth repeating. One day I was visiting someone in a hospital, and I noticed that out in a big common area, a large circle of people was gathered together. And I stopped a hospital staff member I knew, and I asked who all those folks were, and he said, well, that's the family and their minister and some church members who go to that church that one of those teenage boys belongs to. I said, well, what teenage boys? He said, oh, well, there was a bad wreck yesterday. 2 boys rolled their car and they were thrown from it, and both were in critical condition. And I said, well, how does it look? And he said, bad. Even if they survive, they're both likely to have permanent brain damage. Then he shook his head sadly and walked away. So I stood at a distance and watched as the minister led this group in prayer. Many of them were crying. I saw a couple I took to be the parents of the boy, and they were just inconsolable. Then the minister led them in prayer, and he said, Lord, things look bad for Bradley, but we know that you can save Bradley if we only have enough faith. If we believe enough in your power to perform a miracle and heal him, then he will be healed completely. Hearing those words put a big knot in my stomach. I thought, good God, if that boy gets better, and I hope and pray he does, these folks are going to give God the credit for a miracle. And that would be fine, except that if he doesn't get better, if he dies, then what are those parents and the members of that church supposed to think? That God sits up in heaven and decides capriciously who's going to live and who's going to die based on how hard they happen to pray about it? And that all their praying and all their faith wasn't enough to tip the scales in their favor? Is that how they're going to understand the way God works in our lives? Now that might sound like an extreme example, but to one degree or another, I have heard that kind of prayer and that kind of belief expressed a lot. It's very prevalent, even if the situation is not life or death. I do it myself sometimes. If I'm out driving and I'm in a hurry, but I hit one red light after another, I can look up at the sky as if God's floating around up there somewhere, and I'll say, hey, can I get a break down here? What have you got against me today? In the huge spectrum of human problems, between the extremes of life and death and the inconvenience of red lights, and somewhere along the way, it's just kind of become accepted that our relationship with God is like a retail transaction. I'll do this, God, if you'll do that. Or if something bad happens over here but not over there, then it's a big mystery that only God knows about and only God can control. One problem we should all have with that way of thinking is it's really not based on anything in the Bible. But the bigger problem is one of the main reasons anyone you can name stops bothering to have any faith, if they ever did to begin with, is this. If God operates in our lives in a way where we give something in exchange for getting something from God in return, if we pray hard enough, then someone gets healed, or if we give enough money, then we'll be blessed with material things, or if I've only been thinking good thoughts, every traffic light will be green, then why do bad things still happen to good people? Why are innocent people swept away in hurricanes? Why are children born with debilities? Why is there COVID? Why would a loving God ever allow such things to happen? Are we supposed to be satisfied by just shrugging and saying God works in mysterious ways? Because that's not a very good answer. And for a growing number of people, it's a truly pitiful answer that no rational person would ever accept. So it makes sense then for them to say, well, if that's the way God operates, so capriciously and based on some test of faith, and even that doesn't work for a lot of people who are among the faithful, then I just can't believe in that stuff anymore. And that's what so many people believe. And if there's any fault in that, it doesn't lie with God, but with us and the way that we've come to think about the nature of God and how we talk about it. We have not done nearly enough to offer a counter narrative to those commonly held notions that we're in some kind of transactional relationship with God and that God doesn't care for us unless we think the right thoughts and pray the right prayers and do enough things to earn God's favor. So what I'd like to suggest is that we do a big collective reset, if you're willing, at least to give it a try and to see what happens. I promise no big thunderbolts will strike you unless you walk outside during a thunderstorm. The thing is, it shouldn't be a reset at all, but just an honest reading of Scripture. And a great example of the nature of God and the way God works in our lives is in the story of Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus was blind and apparently sat all day begging for handouts at the city gates of Jericho. Now, I've mentioned this before, but in that first century culture, something like blindness was more than a physical debility. It was assumed that either you or your parents had displeased God somehow. Now, since we know from this story that Bartimaeus had once been able to see, that could only mean that he himself must have done something to make God mad, or so the thinking went. So even back 2,000 years ago, folks had a similar concept of God. Do something wrong and you'll be punished. Do something right and you'll be rewarded. So that's an important thing to remember about this story. In the minds of his neighbors, and most likely in the mind of Bartimaeus himself, he had done something wrong, or else he would have 20/20 vision. But one day Bartimaeus hears a commotion, a big crowd heading his way, and he learns that it's Jesus and a bunch of Jesus' followers. Now, by this time, Jesus was something of a celebrity, with a reputation of healing people. So Bartimaeus calls out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, why did he call Jesus Son of David? Because King David was the ultimate king and Messiah in Jewish history and legend. So calling someone Son of David, well, that was high praise indeed. Bartimaeus was acknowledging that Jesus was someone very, very special. When Bartimaeus goes to where Jesus has paused, Jesus says, "What can I do for you?" Bartimaeus says, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus says, "Go. Your faith has made you well." And just like that, Bartimaeus can see. Everyone is amazed, and Bartimaeus decides his begging days are long behind him, and he happily joins in with the crowd that's following Jesus to the next place. What lesson do we usually learn from this story? Jesus healed a blind man because the blind man had enough faith that Jesus could do that. Except that's not what happened at all. Let's retrace the steps. It's safe to assume if Bartimaeus was satisfied with his condition, with his lot in life, with begging for a living, and with believing that God was displeased with him, and okay that everyone else believed that too, there would be no story to tell here. Bartimaeus could have asked what was going on when he heard the crowd approaching and stayed silent, but he did not. Like most people with an opportunity to find wellness, he took a chance on that. He pursued it. And all that life had dealt him, in a world where he had very little control, he took control of what he could. You can define faith in many ways. But one way that I believe is absolutely true is that faith is simply recognizing the opportunity for wellness and wholeness, for a better life for yourself and for those around you, and believing that such things can indeed happen. Because the alternative is resignation, inertia, and decay. To have faith, the Apostle Paul wrote, is to believe in what's unseen, in what hasn't happened yet, but is guaranteed to never happen if you don't take that first step toward healing and wholeness, to feel good and healthy and strong and balanced, physically and emotionally and spiritually. Jesus didn't do that for Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus chose to do that for himself. Taking that leap of faith is what made him well, and able to truly see that life's not a game of accepting the cards God has dealt you and trying to bargain the rest of your life with God for a better hand. Faith is knowing that God already loves you and accepts you and doesn't need you to prove anything, and is with you no matter what, right through every moment of life, good, bad, and in between. God knows life can be hard and unfair and confusing, but God didn't make it that way. God doesn't control who gets cancer or how many red lights you encounter. God doesn't reward you nor punish you. God welcomes you and embraces you and loves you exactly as you are. And faith is knowing that and doing something about it to seek and find the wellness that you need.